Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issues raised by US Vice President J.D. Vance about declining economic productivity in countries that are particularly fixated on mass migration, which is pretty much all the Western countries. I think Vance mentioned Canada and the UK as being the more classic examples, but there are others. Australia fits into that category, as indeed do other Western countries. So it's the mass migration of illiterate third world IQ 70 peasants into the West, and this is obviously going to be a drag on productivity. Who could imagine otherwise? But there are many other factors as well, and I'd like to sort of go through some of these factors now, because declining productivity is an issue. And it's something politicians talk about. Oh, we've got to get the productivity rate up. Well, sure, and they talk big and tough, and then they bring in another few million illiterate, low IQ peasants. So, that'll fix it. So there's a real disconnect between the rhetoric, the reality, the inputs, the outputs, and so on. So this is what I'd like to go through. But productivity is quite a misunderstood sort of thing, and I'll try and make sense of it now without diving into the weeds too far. So there's a few things in the baseline for productivity really was determined when the West was an intensive manufacturing economy. All the Western countries were manufacturers of electrical goods, motor vehicles, textiles, you name it. And the most efficient, most productive manufacturing in the world was in a small group of Western advanced technology countries that were very rich then, the United States and so on, particularly the English-speaking diaspora, but others too. Manufacturing was again the baseline for productivity. This began to change. For example, vast amounts of the manufacturing were sent overseas to low productivity economies. So, if you like it, world productivity declined sharply because the most efficient economies and the most efficient sectors of those economies, manufacturing, were transferred to low productivity economies in the third world, China and India and so on. Now you may say, well, that's crazy. Why would you go, take a high productivity operation and move it to a low productivity third world, shithole country? Well, this was where the divergence between productivity of output and productivity of return on capital began to diverge. And this is a critical thing to understand. Productivity of output is productive, as in very efficient, because you're making widgets the most efficiently with the least amount of cost to produce the most amount of widgets. In a third world economy, however, it's quite different because labor costs and other costs such as environmental controls, this sort of thing, but wage costs are so low that you don't need productivity of output. Not an issue anymore. It's the cost of manufacturing that is the issue, because if the cost is much lower, then you get a higher return on your capital. You get a higher return on the funds you employ. Whereas in a Western manufacturing thing, sure, the returns are high, but they're based on efficiency, productivity, slick management, high standards of operational management, this sort of thing. And this is something that the globalists, and if you like, the vanguard of the globalists, particularly the big finance, wanted to get away from. So if we take the highest productivity areas of the Western economies and move it to the third world, then we get a higher return on funds employed because the wages are so low and so on. And then we also create new consumers in the world economy by doing that. Therefore, it's kind of a win-win for big finance, but it's not a win for the Western working or middle class. Quite the opposite, because their jobs are taken from them. So when you take the most productive, most efficient sector of the economy, manufacturing, and you send it overseas, then straight away national productivity is going to decline, because you've just taken away your most productive sector. And then, so the ratio of manufacturing jobs to service jobs was, say, in 1969 was 50-50. But today it's like 90-10. So 90% of the jobs are in the service industry and 10% are in manufacturing. That might vary a little bit country to country. Germany, for example, till recently at least, had a higher proportion of manufacturing. Quality brand names like, I don't know, Mercedes and Siemens and BMW and so on. But overall, the manufacturing proportion of the economy has declined very substantially, and the amount of service jobs. Now, services, by definition, are not as productive as manufacturing jobs because there are just too many variables you can't control for. If it rains, in a service job, say in a shop, a retail store, for example, if the weather's bad, people don't come into the shop. But if the weather's bad, the factory will still keep on churning out the widgets. So there's big differences in productivity. You have to have a lot of capacity on standby in a service industry, and that's not always going to be productively used or able to be productively utilized. So first thing is the manufacturing was sent offshore, which created a sharp nosedive in productivity of output. Now the big finance and the big multinationals say, well, we're getting more productivity on a higher return on capital. We still own the big brand name, we still own the distribution, and we're just getting stuff made in a third world country at a tenth of the cost that it would to have it made in, say, the United States. They considered that a win, but the overall effect of this was to decline productivity in Western, all across the West, by the way. Productivity declines was seen. Now, there are also a number of other factors contributing to this. The service industries were heavily populated with younger people. So, say, the take-out food stores, they would provide jobs for school kids. So, if I remember just going back to, say, the local grocery store, the local supermarket, the local take-out food shop, McDonald's, whatever. This was, other than the manager and the assistant manager, it was all populated with school kids or college kids. So it was younger kids. Now, in those days, and I don't know if that's still the case, I think it is, but the wages paid to young kids was quite low. So the service industries had a supply of younger labor or young, a lot of kids left school at the age of 15. A lot of kids. I remember, when I was at school, seemed like half the kids in the school disappeared as soon as they turned 15, and they went to do service industry jobs, which range from working in shops, hairdressing, and so on. So, and they were low wage workers. You didn't get an adult wage till you're 21 back in the time. I think that's changed now. Also, if you had higher education, whether it be college or, say, even senior high school back then, you got a higher wage. So there were those sorts of things. Well, but if you were, you go into any shop back then, and it was all sort of 15-year-olds, and apprentices were all 14, 15 years old, that type of thing. But then the Western governments all over the Western world changed the education system. They said, okay, don't leave school at 15. Doesn't matter how fucking stupid you are. Stay on at school. We'll pay you to stay on at school. And the education sector, boomed in terms of employment and so on. Now, teacher jobs are low productivity jobs. Nothing is produced as they teach. The payoff is down the track. The payoff is you highly well-educated kids. They're productive employees, productive workers. They start businesses, they invent the cure for cancer, they hire people, all that sort of stuff. But that's a delayed thing. You educate them today for the benefit years down the track. So the governments decided, Western governments all over decided to say to kids, well, don't leave school. Doesn't matter how stupid you are, stay at school. Doesn't matter, whether you can't even add up one and one. It doesn't. Stay at school. Whereas those kids were previously sent out. So the vast tranche of low-cost labour that was available for the service industries, which was an offset to the low productivity of those industries, that was lost now. Those kids were now staying at school. So that was another hit to productivity, because those same businesses now had to employ older people on higher wages, because there wasn't that availability of 15-year-old kids and so on. Same goes for apprentices, by the way. There became a vast shortage of apprentices because kids weren't getting into apprenticeship till 18 or 19 instead of, as it had been, 14 or 15. This again caused productivity declines. Whether it be through artificially created shortages or that there wasn't the low-cost labour they had been. So all these kids are staying at school. Now, if it had been they were staying at school for a rigorous education, that rigorous education was already in place. If you didn't pass the test, they said, look, you're just not a good enough student. Go and get a job and go and do something. Staying at school isn't worth it. But instead, education was seen as it would create equality, it would create equity. Everybody can have a PhD. Everybody can have 3 PhDs, 10 PhDs. And wow, well, we have an equal world. So the ideologues got into the education. And instead of people staying on at school for a quality education or for a rigorous education, now, if you've got bright kids, maybe the family's poor. Maybe the family needs the kid to go to work or something like that. Then scholarship should be available so the family doesn't have to meet the cost of educating the kid that might be quite bright, but the family just can't afford to pay meet the cost of their education. Now, the cost may not be huge. You look at school books and, at the time, this is pre-computer, of course, you look at the school books and so on, then the cost may not be huge, but to a family doing it tough, it would be a decent outlay that they would maybe struggle to deal with. So scholarship should have been point, but instead of that, they looked at it a huge equity program. This will create social equity. Everybody will have 3 PhDs. So the most dumbass kids imaginable were staying on at school, being gifted high school diplomas, junior high school, then gifted senior high school diplomas. Then they were gifted a place in university. So the amount of like a university that could run on say 200 employees in 1970, they now have 20,000 employees today, delivering bullshit courses like lesbian dance theory. So the kids that were staying on at school were being employed by very low productivity. The whole sector is a low productivity sector, education, but the payoff never came because they weren't using a rigorous education and they weren't educating people to a higher standard. Now, the idea it was sold to the public, if you like, in the beginning, that all these kids are going to stay at school and they come out of school super bright, education. They're going to come out all with PhDs, and that's going to make a high productivity, advanced, high intelligence, high IQ economy. But that never happened. In fact, the reverse was the case. Kids were staying on school because of the need for equity. The standards were lowered again, lowered some more, then lowered after that. So if you come from a designated minority, you don't need to get more than, say, 10% on the exam, even if that, and they still give you a PhD. So it got taken over, the education sector got taken over by ideologues, turned into massive employment opportunities, huge employment opportunities for low productivity people, teachers and lecturers and college administrators and so on. They're the lowest productivity jobs you can imagine, but there was an absolute, explosion in employment numbers in sectors such as education, and also the public service, again, low productivity jobs. So while high productivity jobs being shipped offshore, sent off to China, low productivity jobs were just booming, expanding like you wouldn't believe. And of course, this causes a decline in productivity, particularly economic productivity, as distinct from return on capital type productivity that the big finance was looking at. Now, there are also other factors as well. The competitive nature of the economy. Big money never likes a competitive economy because it creates uncertainty. Big money, big finance, they want certainty. That's what they want, certainty, absolute certainty. So competition means uncertainty. The guys down the road may do a better job. The guys up around the corner may produce a better widget. the guys up here may have a better advertising campaign. Uncertainty, uncertainty. We don't want uncertainty, says big capital. They want monopoly. They want oligopoly. They want backroom fixed government contracts, cozy, corrupt. They want patronage. They want cronyism. They want all the things that create absolute certainty for them. Everyone else can have uncertainty, but not for them. And this crept into fairly quickly, actually crept into the Western economies. Now, if I just pick up a list of the most profitable companies in Australia, for example, or elsewhere, the most profitable companies, and certainly in the top 10 or in the top 100, actually, they're all either monopolies, oligopolies, absolutely dependent on cozy government contracts, or government protection, say in the case where the government won't allow competitors to come into the market and so on. So they're the most profitable companies, but they're also low productivity companies. They're only profitable because it's a monopoly or an oligopoly, or because they're getting overpriced contracts that they couldn't win or wouldn't win, or certainly not win at that price in a competitive market economy. So we're looking at a very anti-competitive economy, and that's where the profits are. Now, it goes further than that. When certainly 30 years ago, an NGO job, working for an NGO, would be one of the lowest paid jobs you could get. And the people that worked for NGOs were either very charitably minded and public service minded, that sort of thing, or they were the down and out people that couldn't do anything else, couldn't get any other job, and they'd be walking around with holes in their jumpers and their ass hanging out of their pants and so on. That's changed now. As I've mentioned many times now, the best paid jobs in Australia and elsewhere in Britain and so on, the best paid jobs are CEOs of NGOs, of alleged, because they're not charities anymore, alleged charities. So if you're working for the globalist propaganda machine, whether the money comes through USAID or whatever, it doesn't really, George Soros, it doesn't matter. But these are the best paid jobs now. So, a senior administrator in a university will get paid 10 times what a manufacturing manager will get paid in a very productive factory. So it wasn't that way. Those sort of jobs in education and NGOs and charities, they were not well paid jobs. The factory manager was the best paid job. That's completely inverted now. Now, also similarly, the money, the big finance class has created a coterie, a cabal of hangers-on and parasites that are not productive or quality managers at all. What does it take to manage or be CEO of a monopoly business? I mean, seriously, what does it take? You can't fuck it up. It's a monopoly, for goodness sakes. Say in certain sectors of the economy, national chain store type thing. In one sector of the economy, there were 9 chain stores competing for the business, and the consumer business. Today, there are 2 in that same sector. And back in the time, a CEO would be paid about 5 times the average wage. CEO of one of those 5 times the average wage in a very competitive environment. Whereas today, with no competition, the CEO is paid 150 times the average wage, including performance bonuses. And it's a fucking monopoly, for goodness sake. The guy gets a performance bonus for running a business in a monopoly. So there's been a complete inversion between productivity, capability, and all those sorts of things. And now the guy, here's a guy who works 3 days a week in the university. I've mentioned this numerous times before. And his job is just to scare up a crowd of placard wavers, student placard wavers on demand. He's paid 2 to 3 times what a factory manager would do. And he produces nothing, creates nothing, builds nothing. And yet those are the best paid jobs now. Now, this is very much similar to communist societies like the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet era, for example, where a teacher, it's a school teaching or college teaching ideology, communist ideology, Marxist ideology. they would be the best paid jobs. But because it was a communist society where kind of people didn't own things, they gave you access to a better quality of life. For example, they gave you a better apartment in a nicer area. They meant you didn't have to wait in line to buy a motor vehicle, and you didn't have to wait in line to get electronic goods like, I don't know, TV or something. So that you could have access to shops that sold Western goods, and so on and so forth. You know, the hoi polloi didn't have access to all that, but you were teaching ideology. And they produced nothing, you created nothing, you delivered nothing. You were just an ideological, fanatical warrior. But those were the best paid jobs. We see this in the West today, that if you're an NGO that's preaching hatred of Western society and hatred of white people, that's a well-paid job. You can get paid $1 million a year for doing that now, but you produce nothing, you create nothing. So this is also part of the wider decline in productivity. Now, when illiterate IQ 70 peasants come from the third world, they can't be given complex written or even verbal instructions. They can't be given complex instructions at all. And I've had to deal with some of these people and see them on, say, construction sites, things like that. They have to be, the amount of supervision they require is out of all proportion. A Western worker doesn't get anywhere near that supervision. And a well-educated worker, educated to a rigorous standard, can be given complex instructions. There are people that I work with. I can give them complex instructions, or even just say, look, this is the outcome we want. How do you best think we can get there? Okay, well, off you go, and leave them to it, and they'll do it. I don't have to supervise them or check their work or anything like that. I just know that there is a level of capability. But you can't say that about IQ 70 illiterate third world peasants. Their capacity for deceit and treachery far exceeds anything, because they come from very low trust societies, and so they're not the sort of, they have to be supervised for it. Not every single one, there are exceptions obviously, but they have to be supervised very. So the entire organizational structure needed to run a highly educated to rigorous standard, to run a highly educated workforce. The organizational structure for that is vastly different from organizational structure to manage, peasants and operate in a monopoly or an oligopoly and so on. So you don't need high quality people in an economy that's not competitive. If you aren't competing, you don't need good quality people or highly educated people or very capable people. All you need is flunkies and drones. So there's been a move to everything can be done by a checklist, and everything is now a checklist, or pretty much, and therefore zombie third world people, it's assumed, can be used to fill those jobs. Now it still doesn't work. So that's a pipe dream in that sense. But the sort of economy that is unproductive and very anti-competitive, that's the economy that the globalists assume they can bring massed peasant third world low IQ folks into. But none of it's working. I mean, it was all a pipe dream at the beginning, but it's all unraveling and unraveling quickly now. We can see the economy of the UK going down the shithole, as indeed Canada and others, Australia too. Hopefully the administration of President Trump and the thought leadership in this instance of J.D. Vance will start making some much needed changes. I would hope that the US will, as the US economy, the globalists used the US economy to stand, act as thug and demand that all the other Western countries, embrace globalization. I would hope that the Trump administration would just as aggressively use the US economy to unwind globalization. There, Tassus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.